Welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a nice stretch and a nice break and are ready to resume a power session now in cross-cultural communication. We have with us as the speaker one of Australia's most renowned cross-cultural experts, Dr. Tom Verghese. Tom is he's a cross-cultural coach and facilitator and founder of Cultural Synergies. He's an energetic speaker and author of 4 books and has worked globally in his 30 years of consulting. He's of Indian origin, raised in Malaysia, and resides in Melbourne. Ergo, cross-cultural is just it's in his DNA. And he has an English-born wife and children. He's an expert panelist on the Global Diversity and Inclusion Benchmark as well. His presentation for the workshop today aims to equip staff working within the aged care sector with the knowledge and skills in communicating effectively with people from diverse cultural backgrounds. Some of the key themes include enabling participants to understand the impact of culture on communication, teamwork, and client interactions, and providing a framework to understand cultural similarities and differences and how this impacts cross-cultural interactions. So it's all there. All participants will receive an e-copy, thanks to Tom, of his book, The Invisible Elephant, Exploring Cultural Awareness, as a resource guide. Please welcome Dr. Tom Verghese.
Good. Thank you very much, Tasneem. Hello, everybody. Great pleasure to be here with you today. As Tasneem mentioned in the introduction, I was born and brought up in Malaysia, so I've been here a long time. I came out here as a foreign student, about 40 years ago. I want to just tell you a quick story about my experience when I first came to Australia. In the first summer of me being here in Australia, I picked up a job. It was my very first job. And it was actually selling encyclopedias door to door. So for those of you in the audience who are young people, you're probably wondering what are encyclopedias. They are these large sets of books that we used to use before computers were around and before we had the internet. That used to be the reference point. So anyway, in my first month of doing this job, I sold absolutely nothing. I went to my manager, my sales manager at that time, Mr. Ian McLaren, and I said to him, Mr. McLaren, please help me. I'm trying really hard, but nothing is happening. And Mr. McLaren said to me, Tom, here is what I'd want you to do. Put your hand out and give me a good, firm handshake. Okay? Put your hand out, give me a good, firm handshake. Now, as you know, in Australia, a handshake is important because a good, firm handshake in Australia demonstrates trust, respect, sincerity. Coming from Malaysia, I shook hands the Malaysian way. And in Malaysia, we shake hands very softly because a soft handshake demonstrates trust, respect, and sincerity. What does a soft handshake demonstrate in Australia? In most instances, insincerity, you could be weak, you may be lying. So all the negative connotations that come from a weak handshake here. So what is the point of that story? Point of that story is that my intention was wanting to communicate effectively. Yet, if it wasn't for my cross-cultural coach who explained to me the difference between the handshakes, I would never have known about it. So my intention was good, but the effect was not what I was getting. So hence it was ineffective. I will eternally be grateful to Ian McLaren for teaching me that. And since then, I have had numerous cross-cultural coaches to help me along the journey. And so that's what we want to talk about today. How do we increase our effectiveness when we're dealing with people of different cultures? Because obviously you are doing that all the time. Here in Australia, 30% of us were born overseas. Nearly 40% of us have a parent, at least one parent born overseas, and For those of you here in Victoria, nearly 50% were born overseas. So how do we actually improve our cross-cultural communication? I'm just going to bring up my slides. So you can have a share of that. Great. Just wanting to check that you can see everything okay there, Tasneem?
Yes, we can.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Okay. We obviously are gathered here from many, many lands. So I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the land that we are gathered on here today. Pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and also to all other Indigenous people who are here at the conference today. I also want to pay my respects to the ancestors of all of you participating here today as well. Here's the intention of our session. What we'd like to do in the next hour and 20 minutes or so is better understand culture. What is this thing called culture? We use it a lot. We use the word a lot, but what is it? What is cultural intelligence? Why is it important for us? I want to spend a little bit of time talking about bias, and the whole idea behind this is so that you can be more effective when working across cultures. Your intent, I'm sure, as people who are working with people in aged care, is to do the best job. And I have no doubt it's a very, very challenging role that all of you play. So therefore, if we can at least improve our effectiveness, we're going to be much better at what we do. Here is really the guideline of what we're going to cover. We're obviously doing some context setting now. I'm going to talk to you about culture, what it is. I want to spend a little bit of time on bias and then talk about cultural intelligence. I'm going to speak for about 25 minutes. I'm going to pause and take questions. And then I'll carry on for another 25 minutes and then pause and take questions. So in other words, I would really encourage you to please use the chat function to get the questions up on anything you want. I'm open to take any questions. And I know you have two platforms here for the questions. So please use this as a learning opportunity to actually ask the questions that you need to ask. In that way, it also becomes a great opportunity for all of us to learn and make this a learning session. Okay? Right. So here's my first question for you. Here's my first question. And you're going to need to put the responses into the chat function. The question is, what are some of the challenges you face working with people from different cultures? So what are some of the challenges? Can I invite you to put this into the chat function? I'm sure Lisa is keeping an eye on it. Tasneem is keeping an eye on it. So they'll be able to feed it back to me because I am not able to see your chat responses.
We're just having, we might be having some tech issues, Tom, because people can hear you, but I don't believe that your screen has been shared.
Oh, you're not being, so you can't see anything?
I think you need to share your slides, Tom, again. But there are some comments coming in on the Zoom, on the chat function. So,
okay.
So some of them, Taz, you've got two comments there coming through.
Great. So let me just kind of check that. So do you want me to stop sharing and share it again?
You could just share your screen, your slides.
Because I'm screen sharing from here. So let me stop share. Let me do it again.
Yep.
Are you able to see anything now?
No.
You can't see anything?
No, Tom, but let's start with the comments, Taz, on the chat.
That's really weird. It tells me I'm screen sharing here.
You can see it now, Tom. We can see it now. It's great.
You can. Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, Tom.
I'm glad we sorted that out. So what are some of the comments that's coming through?
Okay, I'm just trying to locate the comments now. Lisa, could you the comments that I'm getting actually relate to the previous speaker that I can see on the question
That's okay.
board.
I'm happy to run this. Okay, so the first one, Tom, is language barriers.
Language.
We've also got, excuse me, the challenge is ignorance of other cultures.
Yeah, great. Yeah, so language makes such a big thing, isn't it? Especially when it comes to communication, and not just verbal language, but also non-verbal communication. And yes, misunderstandings and the lack of information of different cultures. So Paula Caliguiri is someone who's done a lot of work in this space, and she talks about the challenges in terms of putting them into 3 buckets. And here are the buckets. The first bucket is actually around what is known as relationship management. So what do we mean by that? So when we are dealing with people of different cultures, how do we ensure we have a good relationship with them? Little things like, how do we create empathy? How do we build trust? How do we ensure we have rapport? How do we make sure that we are aligned and that we both understand what we're talking about? So that's one key bucket of challenge. Here's the other bucket. This is around task management. That means, how do we get the work done? At the end of the day, when we're working with people in aged care, we need to ensure that they're taking the medication, that they're following through with what they need to do with their instructions. So there are things that we need to ensure that it's being done. How do we ensure that the tasks are understood and, of course, being followed through? And finally, the next bucket is actually self-management. So what do we mean by that? That means the internal dialogue that occurs for us when we are dealing with people of different cultures. Now, if you're wondering, what is he talking about? It's that little voice in your head that just ask that question, what are you talking about? So it's whenever we are in a situation of, am I doing the right thing? Is this making sense? Are we actually on par? So this is the issues that we constantly have, the constant chatter in our head. So in terms of self-management, so the 3 buckets: relationship management, task management, self-management. I want you now for a moment to pause and reflect on the impact that these challenges have on you as an individual, as somebody who works in the aged care sector, the impact it has on institutions within aged care, the impact it has on hospitals, and finally, the impact it has on the patients themselves, right? So it actually makes it very, very ineffective if we are not able to communicate effectively with culturally diverse people. And look, for a moment, I want you to think about, have you ever had situations of misunderstanding occur with people from within your own culture? Of course you have, right? It's a rhetorical question. And if that's the case, when we're dealing with people of different cultures, how do we know that it's even cultural? And if it is, how do we actually raise it? So hence, it becomes the elephant in the room. I think the previous speaker, Rebecca, talked about, there's couple of those idioms, drinking, I think it was the lizard in the water, etc. All those terms that we use, which are very much part of the culture. So the elephant in the room is the term that's used when we know there's something big that's happening in here, but no one brings it up because we don't know quite how to say it. So in this instance, it is the elephant in the room, because if it is cultural, how do I actually raise it without being politically incorrect or being politically insensitive? Okay. And so that's the name of my book, and which you will be getting a copy of. So I would encourage you to at least scan through that. There's quite a few things in there that you may find useful in your work. So let me just now start with talking about, let's get some definitions of what we mean about this so that we are all on the same page as such. So the largest study on culture was done by a Dutch anthropologist called Gert Hofstede. And he defined culture as the collective programming of the mind which distinguishes one group of people from another. So in other words, it's not where you were born, it's not your passport, it's not the color of your skin, it's not your religion, it's not your ethnicity. All those contribute to it, but actually it's a way of thinking. So in other words, people from a culture tend to share certain beliefs, values, norms. And if you think about it, it's like a shortcut. If you're part of a particular culture, you have a shortcut. You can just understand each other far easier. Another definition of culture is actually the lenses through which you look out at the world. And of course, we have multiple lenses that we use, and culture informs the lenses of our worldview. Now, here's another way of thinking about culture. If you look at this triangle, right down at the bottom, human nature, right? There's something like 7.8 billion people on the planet, all human beings. We all have things in common, don't we? What are some of these things? Well, we all need some form of shelter. We need to have clothing. We need to have food. We need to have water, etc. Physically, hands, legs, and so on. But when we talk about culture, which is the middle part, culture is learned. Okay, we learn our culture and it's specific to a group. So even something like food, which transcends through all cultures, what is considered delicious in one culture may be considered repulsive in another. So here, let me give you a quick example of learned culture. Growing up in Malaysia, being of Indian ethnicity, we used to eat our food with our fingers. My wife is English. So many, many years ago, when I took her back to Malaysia for the first time, she said to me, well, Tom, when I'm in your home, I'm going to eat food with my fingers to demonstrate cultural sensitivity. So I said, yep, that's a good idea. So here we are at our first meal with my parents, my brothers, my sister. 5 minutes into the meal, my wife, Alison, jabs me in the ribs. What is it? And she says to me, Tom, how do you stop the curry and the yogurt from running down your hands? And I said, I don't know. Well, it certainly wasn't happening to me, and it certainly wasn't happening to anybody else at the table. Now, of course, it's an obvious question, right? Why didn't I know about it? Well, of course, I'd learned it when I was from a very young child. It was just inherent. I just knew how to do it. And by the way, there's a whole art and science on how to eat food with your fingers, I have since learned. But it's the same with using a knife and a fork, right? If you've always grown up with it, it's just easy and normal for you. But if it's not, then how do we actually use it in the proper way? What's the right etiquette for it? Chopsticks. Go to Chinatown in any part of the globe, and you will find young 4-year-olds using chopsticks with such a freedom and ease. And then you'll look in the restaurants and you'll notice adults really struggling to get to use that. But that's just something simple like food. But what else do we learn in our culture? We learn things like how to deal with members of the opposite genders, how to deal with hierarchy, how to disagree, how to build trust. What are the things that's valuable? How do you demonstrate things like credibility? We learn all these things in the culture. And who do we learn it from? We learn it from our parents, our grandparents, our teachers, people around us. And they teach us these things because they want us to fit in. They want us to know the rules of the game. Now, of course, do you need to agree with everything in your culture? Nope. And is everybody in the culture the same? No, because of course you have subcultures within cultures. The culture in Darwin is very different than the culture in Melbourne. And even within Melbourne, there are subcultures here within the city. For those of you who've been to the United States and traveled through there, you'll know that the East Coast of the United States is very different to the West Coast. those of you who have traveled to India or have friends who are from India, the Indians will tell you the culture in the northern part of India is very different to the culture in the southern part of India. So there are subcultures within cultures. And of course, at the top of the triangle, everyone is an individual and no one has the same fingerprints as you. You are unique, your own experiences, your own upbringing, and that's what gives you a unique perspective of the world. But what your culture does do, though, is it informs your worldview. And your worldview is a particular philosophy of how we see the world. It also informs us in terms of your mental models. And mental models are frameworks that help us understand the world, that looks at complex issues and makes it, simplifies it so that we can actually navigate through the world. And hence, that's how our brains make sense of how to navigate. So I'm going to just talk about a couple of things. Here's a quick slide with a couple of words. I appreciate that you can't use your chat function, but can you actually make out what the words on the slide are? Hey, can you actually make that out? And for those of you who can use the chat function.
We can use the chat function now, Tom. So
sorry?
We can use the chat function now.
Okay, yes. Great.
So we're back. Mm-hmm.
Good. Is anybody quick enough to put this into the chat function?
Why don't you repeat the question again?
What do you see on the slide?
Yes. Jumping to conclusions.
Jumping to conclusions. Great. Well done to whoever said that.
Yes, I think it was Kalina and among others. Yes.
Kalina, well done, Kalina. And I'm sorry about that. It's a trick question. It was a trick question, but thank you for participating. But it makes the point. It does look like it, doesn't it? It just looks like jumping to conclusions, yet it was incorrect. Now, why does that occur? That occurs because our brains are taking in something like 11 million pieces of information at any one time. However, we can only make sense of 40 to 50 bits of information. So our brains are lazy. We need to have what we call heuristics or rule of thumb. So therefore, we process stuff very, very quickly. And this is then normally called bias. Bias is actually a preference, right? Either for an individual or groups based on our assumptions, our experiences, etc. And these biases can either be explicit, so we are conscious of them. So we may have a bias or an explicit bias to certain types of food or certain types of fashion. But a lot of our biases are actually implicit, unconscious. Okay. So let me give you a quick example of unconscious bias. I've been an independent consultant now for the last 30 years. So I spend a lot of time in my office, either writing, doing podcasts, on the phone, etc. Of course, been on Zoom a lot since the days of COVID. And I have client-facing days like today, where I'm presenting to people. So I had on non-client-facing days, I tend to be very relaxed in my dressing. I tend not to shave. So it was one of those non-client-facing days. I had a 3:00 appointment with an orthopedic surgeon. I turned up to the surgery at 5 to 3. I walked up to the front desk, and there was somebody sitting behind the desk, and there was another lady standing on this side. I walked up, and the person behind the desk looked up to me and said, you must be the taxi driver. I said, no, I have a 3:00 appointment. She said, I'm sorry about that. We were expecting a taxi at 3 and thought you might be. And I said, no, not me. She said, there's the waiting room. So I turn, I'm walking towards the waiting room. I pause, I take 2 steps back, and I look at her and I say to her, that is an example of unconscious bias. At which stage the woman who's standing on this side of the desk turns across and says to me, you are absolutely right. And I learned that from you 2 years ago. And I said, really? Where did that happen? She said, well, I work over at BP, and 2 years ago, you came and did a whole series of work with our leaders, and that's why I learned about it. And I said to her, well, as you can see, it's alive and well. So I'm sitting in the waiting room. I look around, and I think, gosh, the furniture is a little bit old. The magazines aren't the latest ones. So then I have a doubt in my mind. I think, well, actually, I wonder how up to date and contemporary this surgeon is. Is he up with the latest techniques? In fact, what I will do is, regardless of his opinion, I'm going to get a second opinion. Now, I want you to see what I'm doing, right? These are my biases have kicked in because, of course, I'm annoyed, I'm frustrated. I am already making decisions. And that's what happens when our biases kick in. We make decisions, we make choices without really rationalizing or understanding why we're doing it. So I want to now talk to you about 3 common biases that occurs in the workplace. And I'd like you to think about, where have you seen this? Where have you experienced it? Because in that way, it makes more sense for you as such. So here's the first one. This bias is called affinity bias. Now, affinity bias happens because as human beings, we trust, we're comfortable, we are attracted to people who are similar to us. Makes sense, right? Affinity. We have a sense of affinity. So we feel just much, much more comfortable. Now, what happens with affinity bias is it creates in-groups and out-groups. Now, in-groups are people like me. I trust them. I value their contribution. I support them. I remember what they say. And then there's the out-group. The out-group, I look at them as homogeneous. I minimize the differences. I don't support them, and I don't remember their contributions as such. Now, the in-group could be all those of us who work within the facility, and the out-group could be those patients who are staying and living there. The in-group could be those of us who work within the industry, and the out-group could be all the others. The in-group may be people within an organization who are in one department, say, for example, finance. The out-group could be those of us, those people who work in HR, for instance. So I want you to just think about in-groups and out-groups, and where have you seen that, and where have you experienced it? By the way, when you're a member of the in-group, everything feels normal. You don't even notice it. But when you're a member of the out group, you definitely know you're a member of the out group. Here's another one I want to talk about. There are 4 pictures here, 4 photographs of people. They're upside down. I want you to see if you can recognize who they are. Can you please put that into the chat function?
Can you show us the picture?
Sorry, Jasmine.
The picture.
The picture, yeah. Who are these people? Who are these people? Put them into the chat function. Let's see who's quick with identifying all 4. What do we have, Tasnim?
So, Tom, just letting you know that there's a 1-minute delay in what you're saying to what the audience can see. So just to wait.
Okay.
Yeah,
Someone's pointed out Thatcher, Obama, Adele, and Prince William. We have bingo.
Fantastic. Yeah. Really good. Who answered that?
A few of them have got it.
A few. Fantastic. Well done, everybody. Paying attention. That's really good. I'm going to flip them right side out. Lisa, did you say there's a 1-minute delay between what I'm saying and what's landing on the others to the audience?
That's correct, Tom. Yeah.
Okay. So is it out of sync, what I'm saying and the slides?
Slightly out of sync, yeah. So when you ask the audience, you just have to wait a little bit, that's all.
Okay. Well, thank you for that feedback. As you can see, those 4 were correct. But if you look at the photographs right side up, you can see it actually disfigured, right? The eyes are and the mouth are disfigured. They're actually turned upside down. Now, here's the question though. Even though they were upside down and even though they were disfigured, you could still recognize them. Why were you able to do that? Okay. Why were you able to do that? Well, let me answer that for you. It's because you have seen these images so many times, so familiar with them. So this bias is called confirmation bias. Confirmation bias occurs when we're looking for evidence to just reinforce our thinking. Okay, so we have a thought, we have a belief system on something, we look for evidence to reinforce that. You may have heard the term that called the digital echo chamber, for instance, that we read and we listen to, and we're familiar with people who have similar views of the world like us. So where does confirmation bias occur? Well, it may occur in this way. I have dealt with people from that part of the world before, and they are great. So when I come across people like that, it's great. It's easy for me. Or I've dealt with people from that part of the world before. They are really difficult. So if I have a belief system like that, when I see someone like that from that part of the world, boom, confirmation bias kicks in. And it's the same in terms of our people, our interactions, our experience. We look to reinforce our existing belief systems. And the last bias I want to talk about is actually called contrast effect bias. So contrast effect bias occurs if you look at the center circle. Which center circle looks bigger? Okay, which one looks bigger? And of course, the answer is obvious. It's the one on the left. Now, just trust me that the circles are the same size, right? The ones in the middle. But why does the one on the left look bigger? It looks bigger simply because it's surrounded by smaller circles, whereas the one on the right is surrounded by bigger circles. Now, if you think about these as individuals or as people, the large circle on the left may be an individual contributor who's doing a great job, and we promote them and make them a manager without giving them the right skill set, so hence they move to the right. Or think about in terms of language. We talked about challenges when it comes to language, okay? And we compare, many a time people link intellectual ability with language. So we go, well, that person speaks really well. When you're in a circle of people who don't speak the language well, that person must be really smart. Or you move them across into another group where the language comprehension is really good. That person then doesn't seem that smart. So we are always using, our brains cannot exist in a vacuum. We always need to compare and contrast. Of course, here in Melbourne, we're now having winter. I remember a few years ago talking to my brother who lives in Edmonton, Canada. And I said to him, oh, yeah, we had a cold night last night, went down to 5 degrees. And he started laughing. He said, 5 degrees? Now, that's nothing. Minus 30. That's cold. And I said, yep, point taken. Contrast effect. Now, the reason why it's important for us to actually understand our mental models and our worldviews is that when we look at someone's behavior, okay, especially of someone from a different culture, and we look at what's above the waterline, we interpret that behavior based on our norms, our belief systems, our worldviews, and our models. And all we're seeing is one aspect of it. And as you know, that can create misunderstanding, that can create issues, and that sometimes, in many times, leads us to actually reading the wrong information. So part of the challenge when we are working with people of different cultures is, instead of understanding the other, sometimes it's more useful to spend time actually understanding our own cultural preferences first, because all culture is tacit and it's relative. So we use our culture as the base model in terms of looking out at others. So always useful to therefore understand our own culture. Or as was so well put by Edward de Bono, the great philosopher and writer, who said, actions I take are totally decided by the perceptions I have. And whatever perceptions I have are true. Sadly, Edward de Bono passed away just a couple of months ago. A great writer, wrote a lot in the space of philosophy and ways of thinking. So I'm going to pause here for a moment. I'm going to allow some time for questions as such. So if
we do have a few questions. They have been adding up, and I'm going to start with one that's sort of a culmination of a few, and that is, this is brilliant, by the way, this whole notion of being so self-aware and being cognizant of checking yourself before we check others, I think is a very important lesson. This has come up from a few different speakers, but some people have commented that they want to get it right and are scared of getting it wrong when it comes to engaging with presumably clients or even colleagues. So how, in those situations and contexts, would you advise them to act?
Well, I think one of the things we want to always be, I think inevitably, it requires a level of courage. You need to be able to experiment, and you need to be able to try new things. And when we will talk about this more, when we talk about cultural intelligence, a key aspect is always asking for feedback. So asking for feedback, how did that go? Did that work okay? Because unless we get some feedback, we don't know. All of us as human beings have blind spots. Okay, things that we can't see. That's why feedback is really important.
Okay, thank you. Feedback, that's a very central point. Understanding cultural norms and cultural issues of others, when people may be suffering from dementia, for example, how important still is it then to be able to navigate that space if you know that the people that you're working with aren't necessarily going to be receptive?
Yeah, I think that would be a really difficult situation. I think when people are suffering from things like dementia, gosh, I think their whole identity gets lost, doesn't it? So, and how important would culture be? I would think that in those situations, really, it's about demonstrating empathy and compassion.
Yeah, okay.
I'm not really sure how important cultural differences would be actually in that situation. I mean, I don't know to that. Good question, but I don't quite.
Perhaps there's some answers that might come through the chat as well. Moving on to the next one, Tom. What do we do when consumers are not being inclusive?
Yes, so that's a great situation. So we have consumers, for instance, who are coming in and they themselves are unaware. So here's the challenge, I think, when it comes to cultural understanding. Most people, and I'm going to generalize here, most people regard themselves as being reasonably culturally intelligent, actually. Okay. They regard themselves as culture. They'll say to you, look, I grew up in Australia. I went to school with people of different cultures. I've traveled, or I've been to Bali, I've been to Bangkok, and I eat lots of different foods, pizza, sushi, etc. So there, I'm culturally intelligent. So it becomes challenging. So sometimes I think one of the ways, if you're on, is learning how to deflect. How do we learn to deflect? And how do we actually understand that I always go back to that thing I started off with around intention and impact. I always look at what's the intention, and I tend to always try to look at it from most people, their intention is honorable. And so sometimes the impact is not the case because they may not understand and be aware that the way they are behaving is having a negative impact. And hence also, I then need to learn of how do I actually, if the situation allows for it, how do I actually give some feedback?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you. I will take one more question before.
One more and then we'll carry on.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm working for an organization where we do not have many people from different cultures, but would like to engage them in co-designing services. How do you suggest we engage, and what messages can we give to engage this valuable group of individuals?
Great. So I'm kind of assuming when you say you work in an organization that doesn't have a lot of people from culturally diverse backgrounds, I'm kind of assuming you're much more homogenous. I wonder, though, if there are people of different cultures within the community that you may want to tap into. And I do know, for instance, if you look at the Center of Cultural Diversity for Aging, they would have a tremendous number of resources and networks that perhaps you can tap into, because there are many groups of culturally diverse people here, definitely in Melbourne and definitely in Australia, who would be more than happy to help, who'd be more than happy. When you talk to people about their culture, that is really a topic that most people are very comfortable and familiar with, because it's something that they know. And most times people don't actually ask the question. So I would encourage you to ask the question. Ask the question.
Good. Ask the question and engage. Please do engage the Centre for Cultural Diversity and Ageing when we do that. But Tom, back to your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Tasneem, for facilitating those questions. So one of the things that we need to do in terms of becoming much more culturally competent is developing and building our cultural intelligence, right? And cultural intelligence is defined as our ability to function and manage effectively in culturally diverse settings. Now, some of you may have been familiar with the term of emotional intelligence, which is really important in helping us understand our own emotions and those of other people, and helps us build empathy. However, the research actually shows that emotional intelligence doesn't necessarily translate across cultures. So, for instance, you may be very emotionally intelligent in the Vietnamese context, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll be emotionally intelligent within, say, a French context. So cultural intelligence is really around how do we become far more inclusive in terms of being able to be agile when you're dealing with people of different cultural backgrounds. Now, in this model of cultural intelligence, there are 4 aspects. CQ drive, which is what you see on the top left. This is your level of motivation and interest. And by the way, we're going to deconstruct this model. CQ knowledge, differences and similarities that you have of different cultures. CQ strategy, which is really around what's my plan? How do I get on with this? And then finally, CQ action, which is how do we actually put it all together? Okay, so let's start with CQ drive. So CQ drive is really around your level of motivation, your level of interest in dealing with people of different cultures. So if you look at motivation, there are 2 sorts of motivation: intrinsic motivation and extrinsic. So those individuals who have intrinsic motivation are those people who just inherently believe that working with people of different cultures or getting along with people of different cultures is something that's really important. They take it upon themselves as something that they really want to do. And I dare say that for a lot of you working in aged care, for instance, that you would have an intrinsic motivation when it comes to care, because you do a role that requires you to actually be demonstrating that. So intrinsic. The other aspect of drive is extrinsic motivation. And that means these are individuals who may want to be much more culturally intelligent because it helps them in their roles. So, for instance, it's to do with a promotion, for instance, or they become very pragmatic and say, well, in my job, I have to deal with people of different cultures, so I might as well learn about it, because if I can do that better, it's going to help me be better at my job and make it much easier. So it's much more an external drive. So regardless of whether it's intrinsic or extrinsic, it's useful for you to be able to ascertain why or what it is that what is it that's important for you. So let me give you a quick example of that. We worked a couple of years ago with a young woman who was being sent from Melbourne to Bangkok. This was a 2-year assignment. She was being sent over there as part of her work to learn something and then come back here. So when we did our assessments with her, we found that she had very high extrinsic motivation. In other words, she looked at this as a great opportunity. She was going to learn a lot. She was going to help move up the corporate ladder, etc. But her intrinsic motivation was actually quite low. So one of the things I suggested to her was, when you work in a country like Thailand, where relationships are really important, you need to be able to have enough energy and make the effort to actually reach out. Because otherwise, it's very easy to take a posting, go somewhere, and just hang out with people who are similar to you. In other words, you don't reach out. Many times, people who work internationally, and they may have traveled, they show have traveled, but even though they've traveled, they've never had the experience of working with people from other parts of the world. In other words, they travel to Australians who travel, say, to London, they go to Earl's Court, and because if you want to meet Australians in London, go to Earl's Court, lots of Australians there. So it's actually around people hanging out similarly, rather than actually understanding, well, what are some of the things I need to do to actually reach out? Like, what are the things I need to do to broaden my level of drive? So here's a scale. And you can do this as a quick exercise. So you've got low levels of interest, which is around 0 or 1, and 10, which is around high levels of interest. So this is a quick self-assessment for yourself. What is your level of cultural drive? Goes without saying that the higher your drive, the more you will be inclined to put yourself in situations where you will be interacting with people from different cultures. And if your drive is low, perhaps what you may want to do is be thinking about, well, maybe something I need to do because it's part of my job. I'm working with clients who are from different cultures. So what are some basic things that I can just get across so that I am effective and being able to be of service? Here are some quick tips in terms of developing your CQ drive. You are able to actually take a series of unconscious bias tests, and these are called implicit association tests, right? IAT, implicit association tests. They are free. And if you go to the Harvard University website, you can look for implicit association tests, and that will bring up a whole series of them. And in fact, there are now tests specifically for Australia. So if you click on the Australian drop down, and you'll be able to take a series of them on different topics: gender, sexuality, indigenous, ethnicity, etc., just as a way of measuring. And I find that for most people, it's an interesting way to just assess their own levels of biases. And it's quite revealing for most people. We talked before around the questions around seeking feedback. So getting feedback is something that's really important. So as I mentioned, we all have blind spots. How do we actually reach out and ask for that, right? How can you reach out and perhaps be a cultural broker or a mentor to someone else? How can you help someone else understand cultural differences and similarities? Because you find in the process of teaching, inevitably you learn. And I do love that last point, which is be prepared to make mistakes. In other words, it is not possible for us to interact in cross-cultural situations and not make any mistakes. You're going to make some mistakes. The issue is not so much making mistakes. The issue is actually being able to actually bring ourselves back up, dust ourselves off, and get back into it again. And of course, as all of us know as adults, that's what is known as experiential learning, right? Where we make the mistakes and we learn from it. So that is CQ drive. The next aspect is CQ knowledge. So this is where we inform ourselves around cultural differences and similarities. Now, there's something like 220 countries around the world. Here in Victoria itself, we have people from about 200 different countries. So it would be next to impossible to actually understand and get in-depth information of all the different cultures. So in the field of cross culture as such, we look at it at putting the world down into what we call 10 global clusters. Okay. And the reason we do that is so that we can actually understand that there are similarities of people in these clusters. They're not the same, but there are similarities in terms of shared values. So as you can see on this slide, you have the Anglo culture, which is where we Australians sit. And of course, we're talking here about Anglo Caucasian Australians right through to the US. And again, for those of you who've interacted with people from the United States, you will know that there are differences between Australians and Americans, yet there are also a lot of commonalities. And the same thing applies to people from Eastern Europe, the Nordics. So we talk about the Nordics as one region, but of course, there are differences between Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, but there are also some generalities. So if you're dealing with patients or clients from there, what are some of the things that's quite common there? This is the same thing for Germanic Europe and, of course, Latin Europe. And you flip across to the other 5 clusters, which is your sub-Saharan African culture, your Confucian Asia, which is your North Asian cluster, Southern Asia, the Middle East, and of course, Latin America. So again, these are just frameworks, okay, frameworks to be able to say, okay, so if most of my clients are from this particular part of the world, what are some of the things that's kind of important for that? What are some of their values and norms? So we make, therefore, the distinction between stereotypes and generalization. So stereotype is when we talk about a negative or positive judgment and we give it to the whole group, compared to when we generalize, we're basing it on some sort of data, some sort of experience, some sort of fact that we can say, well, that's usually how it fits. So let me give you an example of those two. Coming from Malaysia, so I'll talk about this from the Malaysian aspect. Malaysians have generally a loose concept of time. And so what that means is in Malaysia, most people are not on time. There's a much more latitude and flexibility when it comes to time. People don't get too stressed about it. A stereotype is when we say, well, all Malaysians are late, which of course is not true because there are many Malaysians who are on time. A generalization will be when we say, well, for people who are in Malaysia, they have generally a loose concept to time, which means they're flexible when it comes to time, which would be much more of a generalization. So when there are loads of research on actually what we call cultural dimensions, on what are some of the dimensions that different cultures and countries differ on, I'm going to talk to you about 3, which I think would probably have a significant impact on the people that you deal with. And so here's the first one. This is around relationship and tasks. And what this actually means is that in certain cultures, the focus is very much on building the relationship first before we get on to the task. Whereas in other cultures, it's much more task focused. Now, that doesn't mean in task focused cultures that relationships aren't important. No, it just means that it's not as important to build the relationship to get the task done. So if you think of behaviors, people who come from a much more relationship-oriented culture will be wanting to know things like wanting to know your background, your history, wanting to tell stories, wanting to really get to know you as an individual before they get on with things. And sometimes some of the questions might come across as being quite intrusive. Whereas people who are much more on the task-focused part of cultures will say, well, let's get on with the job. I'll do what I need to do. And that, hey, if we build the relationship along the way, great, let's get on with it, okay? I had a client who was here in Melbourne. She was the director of IT for an organization, and half her team lived in the Philippines or worked in the Philippines. And she used to travel to the Philippines. And my client was someone who was very focused, on task, what we normally call a type A personality. But when she went to the Philippines, those of you who've been to the Philippines, or for those of you who are Filipinos here in the audience, you know that relationships are really important in the Philippines. So people, when they go out for lunch, which when she was always would be taken out for lunch, and by the way, her lunch here in Melbourne would be 20 minutes, whereas there it'd be an hour, hour and a half. They'd be asking her questions like, who are you? How old are you? How old are the children? How's your husband doing? Questions that she thought were totally irrelevant to what they were on about. However, because she was a very smart woman, she figured after a while, let me just do some research on this. And of course, in the conversations, she found that actually it's really their ways of building a relationship. So she made the point of shifting, okay? Shifting. On future trips, she started doing things like, okay, I'm just going to put aside the fact that lunch will take an hour and a half. That's fine. I'm going to sit with that. And she started doing things like asking them, how are your kids doing? How is the church choir going? How's the soccer team going? So she started taking an interest in what was happening for them personally. And one of the results of that was at a Christmas function that they had, she had 30 resumes given to her from people who wanted to join the organization. So just an example of that concept or that dimension of relationship and task. Here's another dimension, hierarchy and equality. So people who come or have grown up in a hierarchical culture view society as being vertical. So high values and respects paid for people, titles, qualifications, age. So rank is important. Whereas people who come from much more of an equality-based culture tend to look at society as being horizontal. So we flatten the scenarios. We tend to call our managers by their first names. We challenge each other. Someone who's junior into an organization can give an opinion, is asked for an opinion, and is expected to have an opinion. So that also plays out in how we react, because sometimes think of behaviors, someone who comes from a hierarchical culture, if they are not dealt with in what they would deem to be a respectful way, may look at that behavior as being rude, and vice versa. So I grew up in a hierarchical culture, and when I became a consultant 30 years ago, one of the things I had to really work on myself was I used to get really intimidated when I worked with senior managers who had big titles, and I was just a consultant, and I used to get very intimidated by them and not be comfortable. I had to really work on myself to be able to just become better in those meetings. And then the third aspect that I would like you to be thinking about and considering is what we call high context and low context communication. So high context communication is when yes may mean yes, yes may mean no, and yes may mean maybe, depending on how it was delivered. Whereas in low context communication, yes is yes. No is no. Very, very clear. So think about the issues that comes up. So when you're in a high context culture, so let me use a language like Mandarin, for instance. Mandarin is a high context language. One word can have 4 different meanings based on the tonality of the voice. So imagine that compared to a language like English, where it is not at all tonal. And think of the number of people who are multilingual, for whom English may be their second, third, or fourth language. And the amount of time, it may only be a short amount of time that it may take someone to translate what they're thinking of in their native tongue, translate that back to English before it comes out. So that process takes sometimes there's a momentary pause. And in some cultures, the language is much more what we circular. So high context cultures tend to be circular, tend to tell stories, use metaphors, whereas in low context cultures, it's much more direct and to the point. And think of the impact of that. Sometimes being direct and to the point, how it comes across to people in high context is, oh, wow, that is so rude, so direct. Why can't you just be softer. And vice versa. Someone who's high context, talking to someone in the low context cultures, people in low context will be saying, get to the point. What is it you're trying to say? So you can see the misunderstandings that occur. So here's just a quick scale for you to think about the different countries. As you can see, low context cultures on the bottom: Switzerland, Germany, Israel, Finland, all countries which are very much on the low context, direct to the point, no, what we call very little fluff. And then Australia is kind of not quite as low, not quite as high, but some of the high context becomes the Arab countries, people from the Indian subcontinent, South Asia, and of course the Far East. So much, much more circular in their speech patterns. And here's the thing that's really important for you to understand is our speech pattern doesn't just dictate how we speak, but it also dictates how we listen. So let me say that again. Your context, your speech patterns doesn't just dictate how you speak, it also dictates how you listen. So if I've grown up in a low context culture, I'm also listening for low context responses. And when somebody says, in many cultures, you will find it's very difficult to say no. Well, why didn't you just say no? I did say no, but there's just different ways of saying no. But if you're not from that cultural group, you just completely miss it. So part of being culturally intelligent and improving our cross-cultural communication is not just speaking differently and being aware of it, but also listening for it. So when you get my book, The Invisible Elephant, you'll be able to get into this in a lot more depth. But here is, if you think of this, the 3 dimensions that we've talked about, I'd like you to just take a moment and think about where would you put yourself on these dimensions, right? Now, of course, you can work on both, but where is your preference? All of us have a default. Where's your preference? Are you more on the relationship side or more on the task? Are you more equality-based, hierarchical, or are you more high context, low context? Because you will find that the miscommunication that occurs in cross-cultural issues will be based on some of these dimensions. Some strategies then for developing your CQ knowledge. Hey, learning a new language. Gosh, as they say, the COVID lockdown has definitely ramped up people learning new languages. That's always a great way to stimulate your brain, increase the neural pathways of your brain. When you can, visiting galleries, of course, when we're able to travel. Watch groups of people, or watch people in different cultures. How do they operate? How do they talk? What's the tone of their voice? What are some of the things that they do? And of course, curiosity. Always a wonderful thing to be curious, to be asking a question. Let me ask you this. I'm curious about this. I wonder why this is the case, etc. And get people the opportunity to explain something to you. The CQ knowledge leads us then to our strategy. And our strategy is about planning, thinking, being prepared, rather than just going in without giving it much thought. Okay, so you need to have a strategy. And let me give you an example of a strategy. I'll give you an organizational. I have a client who is Swedish. They're a Swedish client. And in Sweden, their organizational structure is 4 levels. When they opened their plant in India, they had, in the same organization, they had 8 levels. Okay, so for me, that's a great example of being strategic and thinking it through. Now, the other thing in terms of for you, when you're dealing with your clients, dealing with your patients, one thing that's useful to know is just about speech patterns and how it informs when we are interacting with people. So this is around turn taking, interruptions, and silence. So these are just models, right, to help us understand. So if you think of the first one, which is the Anglo-Saxon model, Western model, you find that person A and person B. So person A is the one on the top line, person B, you find when person A finishes, person B comes in. Person B finishes, person A comes back in. So the gap the gap between each person speaking is actually very short. So one knows about the cue of coming in. Whereas if you look at the second one, Mediterranean, Latin American, Arabs would fall in there, Southern Indians or subcontinent would fall in there, is person A, person B, is that's a constant level of overlap. And sometimes if you're listening into the conversation, you go, gosh, they're all speaking at the same time. Does anybody ever listen? They just overlap. But as you know, they do listen. And then the last one is around Asian languages, which is much more the formal North Asian languages. You find that person A speaks, that's a gap. Person B speaks, there's a gap. Person A speaks. And the gap is purely to demonstrate I'm thinking about what you said, I'm considering my response before I respond. Now, as you may very well have experienced, when dealing with somebody who's taking some time to process, it's so easy for us to jump in and say things, right? Because most of us are not comfortable with the silence. So again, useful for us to think about in terms of strategy. A couple of tips here for you. Again, the point around feedback. Share stories. What's worked, what hasn't worked. Basic small talk. If you're dealing with people from a particular culture and you're dealing with quite a number of them, excuse me, learn some basic words. Hello, thank you, how are you? You know, those things are really great. I love that earlier presentation about the Italian, teaching and learning Italian. It's fantastic. Gives people a way to step out into their own. And of course, mindfulness, always useful when you are dealing with people of different cultures. And finally, CQ action. This is where you put it all into play. Right? What are some of the things that we kind of do? And being conscious of your nonverbal communication, facial expressions, how you use your hands, how you use your body. Of course, some cultures are much more expressive with their bodies, others are not. And of course, your verbal, tone of voice, pitch, modality, etc., all communicates what's my intention and what's the impact. Okay, and always being aware of what is the impact, how is it landing, and am I being effective? Because really, at the end of the day, we want to be effective. So some quick tips again from here. So not just pay attention to the words, but pay attention to the whole person, especially when you're dealing with people who are older, those in aged care, etc. You know, sometimes words are difficult to get out. English is not their first language, perhaps. You know, you want to be paying attention to the whole message of what's coming out. How do you build rapport? Which I'm sure most of you would do well. Clarify. Make sure that we are speaking about the same thing. Right? What does it actually mean when someone uses terms? Because sometimes we can use words that actually we think we understand, but are we actually talking about the same thing? And always a great believer in taking the time to pause. Because you find if you do that and take a breath, it gives an opportunity to come into the conversation. So again, observe, get feedback, develop a level of humility, because it is not possible for you to learn everything there is to know about a different culture. You can always, it's one of those things that you'll be a perpetual student in, okay? And of course, seek out a cultural mentor. Seek someone out who can help you with some of these things. And someone that you can say, well, this is what I've noticed, what should I do here, etc. Somebody who's walked the path before you. So the 4 aspects of CQ: cultural intelligence, CQ drive, your level of motivation, intrinsic or extrinsic, CQ knowledge, cultural differences, similarities, how it informs you, how it informs your strategy, what's your plan, and then, of course, how do you execute when it comes to CQ action. So I'm just going to give you a minute as a reflection time before we go into questions.
Thank you, Tom. There's a lot there. There's a lot there to get through, and it's all very, very sequential. Again, very intuitive. That's my word of the day. But there's plenty there to get on with. Look, while some of the delegates come up with questions, I'm going to ask a couple that have come up during a presentation that I wanted to speak to. The first one is the aged care workforce is very diverse. Is there any training that you can suggest that might be useful in managing and supporting a diverse workforce?
So say that question again, please, Tasneem.
The aged care workforce
Very
is
diverse.
very diverse, right? Is there any training that you can recommend on managing and supporting a diverse workforce?
Oh, absolutely. Call us.
There was that. Yeah.
That was a good segue. No, just kidding. No, I think, look, here's something that we need to appreciate and understand. When you're dealing or managing or leading a homogeneous workforce, it is far easier. Because look, let's imagine we're all living in Korea. We're all Koreans. So think about it. We all speak the same language. We all like the same food. We've been in the same sort of schooling. We have the same kind of background, right? Just in terms of homogeneity. That's not the case here. So as a leader, as a manager, you really need to be having a far greater repertoire in actually dealing with the diverse workforce. So you need to be actually far more conscious around your own cultural norms. What is it that you expect of leadership? Because we all have a model of leadership, by the way, in our heads. Most people are not able to give you a philosophy of leadership, but they do know what a good leader looks like. And a good leader in the Australian context, for instance, would be very different to a good leader, say, in the Malaysian context, as an example. So how do we learn to broaden our repertoire as a leader? How do we broaden our repertoire so that we can be far more effective in doing that?
Good thinking. Thank you. The next question I have up is, Tom, do you think some of these cultural differences are changing as we become more globalized? After all, culture is ever evolving.
Culture is definitely evolving. Definitely, for sure. Some of it is evolving, and some of it is changing. What's been really interesting about COVID-19 is if you think about globalization, the aspect of globalization was that we were back in the mid-90s, someone called Thomas Friedman wrote a book called The World is Flat. And the whole philosophy at that time was globalization is going to open up the world. It was going to equalize things. And of course, it did open loads of opportunities for many, many countries. I mean, look at the rise of China in terms of being the manufacturing hub of the world, India being the back office of the world. So it provided loads of opportunities. At the same time, one of the realizations on that was actually it wasn't equal. So, it didn't give equal opportunities to loads of people. The kind of global financial crisis in 2008 really put an impact on it. So again, it was, we're streaming ahead. How do we actually open this up? But what COVID-19 has done, it has made everybody far more insular. Countries have just looked at their borders. How do we become just much more inwardly focused? And I think it will take a little bit of time to get back into being outwardly focused again. And so when we become inwardly focused, our own culture becomes far more important. Okay. Any other questions, Tasneem?
There was one that was asked a little bit earlier that I might come back to. And it asked, where there are people, it's just disappeared off from me now. I think it was where there are people from different multicultural backgrounds who may not feel confident in navigating the space, I presume as consumers or clients. How do we make them feel more included?
Well, I think again, what we need to have, this is where allies come into play, the importance of allies, the importance of having advocates, the importance of having perhaps other people who can speak on their behalf. And this way again, the language comes in. How do we have a level of empathy? How do we have a level of compassion? In doing what we need to do. So it's about how do we give access to people to actually talk about what their requirements are. So I think that would be really important. So I'm going to wrap up before I hand over to Tasneem. So we've covered a lot here today. We talked about what is culture, programming of the mind. It's very important to understand our own cultural preferences. We talked about bias, the different types of biases that we see in the workplace. I talked about 3: affinity bias, confirmation bias, and contrast effect. And then we talked about the kind of the CQ model, right? Your own drive, intrinsic or extrinsic, CQ knowledge, how familiar we are of cultural differences and similarities, informs our strategy. Who am I dealing with? Who are my target groups? Who are my patients? How do I adapt? How do I adopt? And then, of course, action, where I put it all into play. So, and again, as Tasneem said at the start, you'll get a copy of my book next week. So please feel free to go through that. And if you have any questions, please reach out to me. My son.
Sorry, just Tom, if you have a minute, there's just one question that I think has piqued my interest, and I think a lot of people are thinking this, which is, could you talk about not being afraid to make mistakes if you're trying to increase your cultural intelligence, and the importance of saying sorry when you get things wrong?
Yes. So sometimes it's always good to ask for forgiveness, right? before you start. So, if we do try something and we make a mistake, so most times, again, I think we need to trust our intuition. So when we do something, most times, if you've made a mistake, something tends to trigger within us. We go, ooh, that wasn't quite the right thing. And I talked about the invisible elephant, the elephant in the room. So we don't say it, rather than actually raising it, right? Making it more explicit. And you may, out of curiosity, you may say, look, was that a mistake? Should I have done that differently? I'm sorry if I offended you. So actually having a level of humility. Yeah. And it's about having the courage. So sometimes what political correctness has done is actually stopped us from engaging in conversations, because we don't want to offend. So I don't want to ask the questions, rather than actually coming from a space of curiosity and saying, well, let me ask the questions.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of important. So hope that kind of, that. And you find most people are forgiving. Okay, most people are forgiving because it demonstrates you're making an attempt. I'd rather you make an attempt and get it wrong than not try at all.
Yeah.
And I think most people you find will be like that. I think most of your patients will be like that. Because, they're all people who've lived a long life, right? So
that's true. I think it's better to ask, not that there is a dumb question, but it's better to ask the dumb question than no question at all.
Absolutely.
And to put yourself out there. Look, Tom, thank you so much for your time, for your diligence with this presentation, and just for really opening up so much of, I think, what is the bread and butter of how do you traverse that tricky space of cross-cultural communication when people are not like us. And how do we make that work? So I think it's been extremely, extremely beneficial. There's been a lot of questions about how we can get hold more of your work and more of your training. I do know that the ebook that's coming out will probably provide hopefully some links to your other bodies of work, which are pretty vast, and also your contact details in that space again. So look, please, everyone, thank you. A virtual clap and applause for Tom Verghese for his amazing presentation today. Thank you so much, Tom. It's just been incredible. I should point out now, before we break into our next little break, we are going to have a 5-minute break, then resume with the next part of the conference. But I want to draw everyone's attention to the main page of the conference program has a section called Connect Now. Now, if you click on that section, I believe it will take you to other delegates that you may want to share your information with, like your website or your email address, even your phone number, I presume, or elements of your contact details that you want to share. So please feel free to use that platform. It's been designed specifically to enable delegates to connect with each other in a more practical way. So by all means, keep up the conversation. We want that. But in terms of progressing contact, please feel free to leverage the Connect Now function. Look, we are going to take a short break, and I'm just checking the agenda, which I believe means we are hoping to reschedule or come back together in about 5 or 6 minutes. So at 3:55, we'll reconvene for a panel discussion. And I look forward to meeting the panelists and having a pretty fruitful discussion about that. But until then, again, Tom, thank you so much. And everyone, enjoy a bit of a stretch for the next 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye-bye now.